Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Duke. Welcome to this week's Takeaway. Back again with Alex Newman. And Alex, I'd like to point out that the education department, the progressive educrats, chickens are all coming home to roost, but I'm not sure they know how to spell roost, and I don't know if they know what chickens are. What's going on in Baltimore, Maryland? How dumb and uneducated could our kids possibly get?
Well, it's hard to imagine them getting any dumber or any less educated. The latest numbers out of Baltimore for 2017 show that a full one-third of all the government high schools in Baltimore cannot produce a single child, not even one kid, who is even proficient in math. So, when we're talking about proficient in math, we're talking about dumbed down Common Core standards. A first grader, a second grader should be able to do this, maybe a third grader. And yet these schools cannot produce one child who can do it. Then you have another six schools, taking it up to almost half of all the government high schools in Baltimore, that have only been able to produce less than 1% of children who are proficient in math. So taken all together, if you look at the bottom half of all the high schools in Baltimore, they had something like 3,800 students who took the government mandated test, and something like 14 of them were rated proficient in math. And proficient is nothing to write home about. So.
Right, and we know that the word, playing devil's advocate here, we know the word proficient is racist. We know that we're forcing these kids in Baltimore schools to take tests that measure their performance. That's racist. That's discriminatory. This is, after all, Baltimore. Typical big city in a blue state run by liberals, and they can't teach their kids. All gallows humor joking aside, this question of proficiency really is something important. Because to you and I on the outside, and to most moms and dads who have their kids in these government schools, we want our kids to be better than proficient. We want our kids to be adept at things like math and reading and writing. We want them to understand history at a high level. That's off the table now. This is what we have to realize. You and I want proficiency or beyond, but the public schools don't. Proficiency is not the ambition of our government schools. They are not interested in getting our kids proficient in basic subject matter. That's a gift. If they can provide students with all the sociology, the sexualization, if they can succeed in replacing parents as the moral arbiters of their kids' development, that's good. And if they can read and write and do math, that's a plus, but it's not mandatory in these schools. It's not the first priority anymore.
That's exactly right. I'd be willing to bet that a lot of these kids in these schools could tell you about gender theory and global warming and, what LGBT stands for and the different terms for different sexual perversions. And yet they can't read, right? We hear from one of the guys who runs the charter school that apparently is a success because they have, 14% who are proficient in math. And apparently that's successful by Baltimore standards. And he says that more than 9 out of 10 of the kids here in this school district cannot even read properly. So they can't even be proficient in reading. So this is a disaster. We actually wrote about the Baltimore schools earlier this year at the Newman report. 6 of them, or maybe even 7 of them, could not produce one single child who was either proficient in reading and writing or who was proficient in math. So they couldn't produce one single kid who was proficient in anything except maybe, the brainwashing and the dumbing down and the values clarification. This is an absolute disgrace. And, they'll say, well, the Republicans did it. Well, there's no Republicans in Baltimore. They say, well, we need more money. Well, you already have more money than virtually any school district in America. You're in the top 3 or 4 in spending per pupil. Money's clearly not the problem. The problem is the whole system. And that's what we've been trying to show here for many, many months.
Well, and it's remarkable to me. You mentioned the money issue. That's always the answer, isn't it? If evil Republicans dumped 3 times as much money into the public schools as they've been doing for the last 100 years, it seems, the kids are going to get 3 times dumber if we measure this money dumped in ratio to actual performance. So it seems to me that maybe the only way to fix the broken schools, again, I'm being kind of gallows humor here. It's a pathetic situation. Maybe the only way to fix the schools is start pulling money out. If adding all this money makes the scores go down, maybe pulling it out might raise them. But having said that, what do we expect with regards to math standards when you've got so many among the liberal talking head intelligentsia arguing that math is racist, that right answers are racist, that math and geometry and the kind of logical thinking that goes along with making kids mathematically profound and proficient, that itself is a holdover of white privilege and white patriarchal blah, 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 blah. We've got the entire left arguing that logic, reason, mathematics itself is some kind of a white conspiracy to keep African American and Hispanic kids down. And that's where I want to go and to turn this over to you again. Los Angeles schools. We saw last year that horrifying statistic that as many as 80% of African American male kids in the LA school districts, all throughout California, not just LA, can't read at their grade level. We can't even read at the high school grade level. Now you've got inner city Baltimore kids who can't do math. Almost none of them can do math. As typical of liberalism, who's hit hardest by liberal programs? Who suffers the most under liberal programs? It is exactly the minority populations that seem to be chained to the Democrat plantation.
That's exactly right. And Washington, D.C., I think is a perfect illustration of this. You have in Washington, D.C., according to the government's own numbers, you have more than 2/3 of the adult population, 15 and over, that is functionally illiterate by the government's own standards. So they're probably, so illiterate they probably couldn't basically read a stop sign. They probably recognize the shape. But and that's what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with, the parents here were told, hey, give us your children and we'll teach them to read and write and all the rest. And of course, they didn't do that. Instead, they dumbed them down, they indoctrinated them. And, we have a situation now where the overwhelming majority of the population in D.C. that's been made dependent on the government, that's been educated, so-called, by the government, that's being fed by the government, cannot even pick up a book or a newspaper or even read a soup can. We have a disaster of epic proportions unfolding in this country. I think people need to think through the implications of having a society where the great majority of the population can't read, can't do even the most basic math, has no clue even about the most rudimentary elements of logic. They have no way of determining whether something they're being told is true or false other than their feelings. We're in huge trouble. And the thing is, this is a crisis that can be remedied, right? We know how to teach reading. You can teach a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old how to read almost effortlessly with almost no money. I'm using a book on my 7-year-old published in like 1900, and he's doing algebra, and he's 7 years old, right? It's not rocket science. The problem is the school system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. And, until people get that in their head, until people realize that, no, it's not that you just have a bad school district. It's not that you just have bad teachers. It's not that the kids aren't getting proper nutrition, right? They don't need government breakfast to fix this. They don't need government dentists at their schools to fix this. What they need is schools that actually are designed to teach and not to dumb down.
Well, we have David Coleman, the architect of Common Core, arguing that facts don't matter in history. We've got liberal talking heads and educrats and college professors arguing that logic and reason and right answers are unessential to math. We've got the Common Core math standards with our English standards, the preferred Common Core reading list that takes out great literature. My kids at the university are coming to me now without even reading books. I'm hearing from my university kids that in their high schools, they don't read a single book cover to cover. They're just reading little excerpts and passages. When they read Shakespeare in high school, they read No Fear Shakespeare. They're not even reading Shakespeare. They're reading the Cliff Notes version of Shakespeare in the classroom, and they're only reading 2 or 3 speeches, completely and utterly devoid of context. This is the way we're educating kids, miseducating kids. And you said it. If we're going to graduate kids, and the other thing, nobody fails anymore. You can't hold kids back. None of these thousands of kids who are unproficient in math in Baltimore schools are going to have to stay back a grade, because that would be racist. Because you're holding back primarily in inner cities like Baltimore, you're holding primarily minority kids back, right? While white kids in Omaha, Nebraska are moving forward gleefully. Social injustice here. So these kids will be socially promoted, and then they'll get into colleges desperate for minority representation. These kids will get scholarships, they'll get their books paid for to go to college without having any ability. And what'll happen is once they're in universities, and I can speak firsthand about this as a university professor, once they're in universities, there's no way in hell those universities will fail those kids or remove them, because you brought them here not for their academic achievement, you brought them as diversity trophies. So you're going to make sure, if it means lowering the entire standards of the university system, which is what we're doing, completely lowering university standards so that we can make people feel good rather than promote excellence, what you're creating here is a entire generations of kids who must go to government for help, who must sacrifice their liberty and their freedom and their opportunity for government subsidies, welfare, handouts, and that's the vision of the left. That's the leftist vision for America.
Yep, and I mean, you can see it now. Go to a fast food restaurant, try to order something, right? See if they can calculate your change. See if they can get your order right. I mean, we're witnessing the breakdown of our society, of our civilization, as a result of this. This is not happening in a vacuum. There's a very clear agenda. The effects, the fruits of this are starting to become very clear now. And this is a road straight to disaster unless we hit the brakes and start teaching these kids to read, to do basic math, to have some semblance of, what is history, how does one determine truth, what is logic. Unless we get back to teaching these things, we are heading for a cataclysm.
Unfortunately, the bus, driven by leftist educrats, that's going over a cliff, it has no brake pedal. Mom and Dad, get your kids out of these schools. Alex, thank you again. We look forward to another takeaway next week. If you enjoyed this video and all of our videos, please consider a tax-deductible donation so we can keep the whole thing free for you. I'm Dr. Duke. Thanks for watching.